Hello, everyone, and welcome at the second keynote session of this 2021 Isn't by Xchange initiative. My name is Svenny van Lippevelde. I'm from Ghent University in Belgium, and I'm very happy to chair this session. Before I introduce our keynote speaker of today, I first want to highlight that if you have questions, you can ask them via the Q&A below the video, and we will try to answer as many as possible after the presentation. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Meera Shekar. Dr. Shekar is the global lead for nutrition with the World Bank and program manager for the Power of Nutrition. She has led the repositioning of the nutrition agenda that led to the new global Scaling Up Nutrition Sun initiative, and was a key thought leader on the catalytic financing facility for nutrition that evolved into the Power of Nutrition. Dr. Shekar serves as the elected chair for the Sun Executive Committee and has been one of the principals for the 8 Architecture for Nutrition and G8 and G20 agenda setting process for food security and nutrition over the last several years. She leads the costing and financing analysis, the first ever global investment framework for nutrition, and is the author of the World Bank's first analytics on the health and economic consequences of obesity. She has extensive policy and operational experience in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Before joining the World Bank in 2003, she led UNICEF's Health, Nutrition, and Water Sanitation and ECD teams in Tanzania, the Philippines, and Ethiopia. Dr. Shekar has a PhD in International Nutrition, Epidemiology, and Population Studies from Cornell University, is a commissioner on the Lancet Commission on Obesity, as well as a member of several advisory boards, such as the Cost of Obesity Group. Dr. Shekar, the floor is yours, and I'm very much looking forward to hear your presentation.
Thank you very, very much, Wendy, for that very kind presentation and introduction. And thank you for inviting me to give this keynote. I'm truly honored to do that. I'm gonna try and share my slides with you. And oops, excuse me one moment. Give me just one moment. So while I get my act together. Share screen. Okay, I'm hoping that you can see my slides now. So I'm going to take you on a very quick tour around nutrition, mostly nutrition, but also food systems, and really focusing on building human capital. And I will go through this fairly quickly so that we have some time for discussion. The first and most important thing for all of us to remember is that it's the first 1,000 days of a child's life that is absolutely critical for brain development and for future human capital. So here you see the brain of a healthy, well cared for child. And here is the brain of a child that has been stunted in the first 1,000 days of his or her life. And we know from all the evidence in the world that most of the brain development, whether it's sensory pathways, language, even some of the higher cognitive functions, that happens before the age of 2. And that's why we really focus on this, what we refer to as a window of opportunity, starting from before pregnancy until about 2 years of age. And we know that if we make these investments in time, there are benefits to be had in terms of increases in schooling, in earnings, in poverty reduction, as well as in terms of the economy. And we know, again, from all the evidence in the world, that the world loses about $3 trillion every year to undernutrition, and roughly 1 to 2 trillion per year in terms of overweight or obesity. So addressing these issues is absolutely critical. And some of these things you will see in the links that we have at the bottom. You can, if you need more information, it's out there. So that's mostly from a global public good point of view that we look at those benefits, but also from a private sector point of view. There's a recent Chatham House report that shows quite clearly that, in fact, there are benefits to be had even for businesses, for the private sector, is losing billions and billions of dollars. And I won't read you all the numbers, you can read them later, but they are losing lots of potential resources because of undernutrition, because it reduces productivity. And that's both stunting and anemia has been well documented. So that's why we at the World Bank have been talking a lot about something called human capital, which is essentially how much human capital or productivity can this child who is born today, how much can she expect to acquire by the time she's age 18, given that there are risks to all kinds of things, poor education, poor health, in many of the countries where we work. So there are three components of something called the Human Capital Index. And if you Google it or look at the link at the bottom, you should be able to find more information. But there are three components: survival, how long will these children survive, schooling, how much schooling will they complete, and health. And if we unpack the Human Capital Index, we know that every element of the HCI is linked to undernutrition. If you look at survival, it's more than 45% of under 5 deaths are linked to undernutrition. If we look at the quality of learning, again, there's lots of evidence that stunted children, anemic children learn less in school, as well as iodine deficient children. If we look at the health component of the index, we already talked about stunting. Child stunting is the key marker of undernutrition. It's also a key component of the Human Capital Index. And I know this audience is more interested on the overweight obesity side. And here you see one other component is the adult survival rates. And we know that rising obesity rates across the world contribute to non-communicable diseases and lower adult survival rates. So I just want to emphasize this fact that nutrition, both undernutrition and overweight obesity, are very closely linked to the Human Capital Index, which determines future productivity in the world. And this is just a slide that summarizes across the world that as stunting rates go up, human capital is lower. As stunting rates go down, human capital is higher. And you can look at your favorite country at a later time if you wish. And we know globally about 149 million children are chronically malnourished or stunted. And of course, much of this is in Africa and South Asia, but there are other parts of the world as well, as you can see, where the problem is quite acute. At the same time, and that's very interesting, we see that globally 2 billion, more than 2 billion adults are overweight or obese. And you see these numbers as they look, or these maps as they looked in the 1990s. And if you look now in the 2020s, these numbers have rapidly increased. And much of the increase you see is happening in the low-income countries. And this increase that we are seeing in overweight obesity, it adds to the risks of NCDs as well as mortality, including COVID-related mortality. And no session today is complete without talking about COVID. So the most recent joint malnutrition estimates show, as I said earlier, 149 million children globally who are stunted. But if you look at, numbers are wrong. So this red line is actually for Africa, and this green line is for South Asia. There's sort of mislabeling over there. So we've seen in South Asia rapid declines over time. But in Africa, we are seeing increases in overweight and obesity. At the same time, East Asia numbers have been going down. And if we look at overweight among children, we see rapid increases. If you can see this blue line over here on the right-hand side of the graph, rapid increases in East Asia and the Pacific. And then also we're seeing increases in Africa as well as other regions of the world. So simultaneously, what we refer to as a double burden of malnutrition, undernutrition and overweight obesity at around the same time. And interestingly, while we always thought undernutrition was a problem of the poor only, this slide shows numbers from two countries, Ethiopia and India. And no surprise that this is the poorest income quintile, and this is the highest income quintile on the right side. No surprise that the poorest quintile, whether in India or in Ethiopia, they have high rates of stunting. But what is surprising is that even in the highest income quintiles in both countries, and almost every country we see this, stunting rates are fairly high, and that is quite a surprise. And same thing on the overweight obesity side. As we see economies grow, we see that the shift, the burden of overweight and obesity really shifts towards the poor. And these are numbers for adult females. If you see in Ghana, with the GNI per capita of 2,200, most of the problem lies in the highest income quintile. Same thing in Guatemala, you see a little bit of shift as incomes go up. The poorest start, or the poorer quintiles start getting more issues as well. And then as GNI goes up, you see that in fact the poor really carry a large portion of the burden of overweight and obesity. For the undernutrition side, just shifting to the trying to solve the problem, on the undernutrition side, we have put together what we refer to as the Global Investment Framework for Nutrition, which basically pulls together the evidence on an affordable package of nutrition-specific interventions. And I won't read all of them. You can see them in the circle here. We've also estimated that globally we need an investment of about $10 per child every year, which translates to about $7 billion per year. And that is needed over and above investments in what we refer to as nutrition-sensitive interventions in water and sanitation, women's education, health, and certainly women's empowerment, and on the agriculture side, food availability and diversity as well. As I said earlier, we cannot have a conversation today without looking at what COVID is doing to nutrition outcomes. And we have a paper that is being released quite soon, published quite soon, that shows that after COVID, and these are moderate estimates, they're both pessimistic and optimistic estimates, but this is the middle. We anticipate an additional 2.6 million children that will be stunted over and above current stunting levels. And similarly, 9.3 million children that will be wasted, which means it's severely increasing the chances of death. Similarly, any maternal anemia rates are expected to increase. At the same time, we know that obesity increases COVID-related deaths by 48%, and it increases hospitalization by 113% and ICU admissions by 74%. And this has been published already. It's really a challenge for nutrition on both ends of the undernutrition and the overweight obesity thing. I keep bringing these two things together, undernutrition and obesity, and one of the reasons, many reasons to do that, partly because these conditions coexist in many countries that we work in, And also partly because we know that there are links between undernutrition and obesity and the consequences for future growth in life. And I think all of you may have heard about the fetal origins of adult diseases. If you haven't, that's a link you can click on for sure. And essentially, it shows that what happens, again, going back to the first 1,000 days, what happens in child growth in those first 1,000 days increases the risk of adult diseases like the cardiovascular diseases, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes. We also know that breastfeeding protects against many of these things, including overweight and obesity. So again, the links between undernutrition and obesity are really very strong. And I don't want to not mention the fact that obesogenic environments are really critical, especially again in childhood and adolescence. We know on the obesity side, nearly 1 out of 2 adults and 1 out of 5 children are overweight or obese in the world. And that comes as quite a surprise to many, many people. What also comes as a major surprise to many people is that more than 70% of the overweight, obese individuals live in either low or middle income countries. Most people think this is a problem of the rich. It's not. It's actually, like I presented earlier as well, one of the earlier slides, it's really expanding to the low middle income countries. And again, there's a link at the bottom of this slide on a publication that we released recently. Another surprise is that 55% of the global rise in overweight and obesity is actually in rural areas. Again, we always thought this is an urban problem. It's not limited to urban areas alone. We have pulled together a sort of conceptual framework on factors that affect obesity. I'm sure everyone in this room knows these sorts of conceptual frameworks quite well, but I think it's really important to look at some of both the direct factors, early life nutrition we just talked about. Certainly diet has a huge impact, as well as physical activity that I know this audience is very interested in. And outside of that, there are so many factors from social cultural norms to the design of the built environment that you live in, food systems, trade liberalization, all of these things have a huge impact as well. And we also know that obesity has a big impact, as we've talked earlier, on NCDs, whether it's diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, cancers, or other diseases. There's been some work done on the economic costs of obesity. Like I presented earlier, on the undernutrition side, there's been a fair amount of work done, and we could pull together an investment framework. But on the overweight obesity side, we are not there as yet with all the evidence or the numbers in terms of costs. Estimated costs are about 2 trillion based on just a few studies from the US, from China, some from Indonesia. But this is really an area that needs more work. And then there are additional costs that are associated with increased water use and carbon emissions that are linked to the indirect causes of overweight and obesity. So we pulled together some potential strategies that we at the World Bank hope to work on to address overweight and obesity. And these are some of the lessons emerging from successful countries like Chile and Mexico. I think everybody's heard about successes around taxing unhealthy foods, nutrient profiling models, limiting access to unhealthy foods and marketing of unhealthy foods, especially to adolescents and children, but also working with schools in terms of school food services. But I really I've emphasized this area around enhancing urban design and transport and building designs, it's not the sort of thing that those of us who work in nutrition or epidemiology or public health really think about, but we have really started conversations with some of our colleagues who work on transport or building design to see how we can work with them to improve the design of these buildings to enhance what our colleagues refer to as active transport and active building designs. And then, of course, promoting healthy diets and physical activity that I know all of you are very keen on, again, especially for children and adolescents. And again, food systems and scaling up prenatal and early childhood interventions are critical. So if you look around the world, there are about 42 countries that have implemented taxation around sugar-sweetened beverages, and these numbers are growing every day, which is all good news, and we're learning from them as to how to design these taxes. It's a complicated way of designing taxes, so learning from each other is absolutely critical. At the same time, we're seeing many countries that have introduced either mandatory or voluntary front of package labels on foods. And that too is a learning process as we move along. And you might find your favorite country here. As you will see, many of the countries here are first world countries, but we are seeing this sort of thing happen in other parts of low and middle income countries as well. Chile has been one country that has been particularly successful in achieving results. And they've done a fair amount of evaluations as well. And they've really focused on a nutrient profiling that is high in added sugar, added sodium, as well as saturated fat and energy density. And all of these issues have been subject. So it's not as if you can use one strategy to address the issue. You have to do a package, just as we did for the undernutrition side that I showed you, the investment framework. But some combination of front of package labels. So those of you who are interested must look at the Chile example. Marketing restrictions, sales on advertisements, as well as they haven't, or at the time we did this, they had not implemented taxation as yet. But this is something they're working on as well. Now I want to shift gears to physical activity and obesity. And perhaps many of you in the audience know much more about this than I do. So I'm just going to speak to the big picture issues. But essentially to say that while we all really want to believe in this, we don't have all the evidence that physical activity reduces obesity. There are some studies that do document it. Most of them are in either middle-income countries or high-income countries, and that's perfectly fine. And if we look at the types of interventions, it's either school-based physical activity with curricular sessions or aerobic, a study by Kelly and Tim Kelly and others on aerobic exercise. And it showed that when you do that in combination with strength training, it does reduce fat mass and body fat percentage. Others have shown that combining physical activity with dietary interventions is effective, but not alone. And so I think this is an area where we are still learning. There are a few other studies on adults, and Kim et al. have done some work showing that among obese individuals, there is a dose-response relationship between intensity of aerobic exercise and weight loss. There is some evidence from overweight, obese women as well. But like I said, this is an evidence base that still needs to grow. We don't have a definitive answer as yet. But having said that, the current recommendation as you will see from the World Obesity Federation, is that despite the limited evidence base that links exercise and weight loss, I think what is well known is that exercise confers significant both physical and mental health benefits for everyone, including for people who are living with overweight and obesity. And benefits include reductions in blood pressure, hypertension, improved even cognition, especially among older adults, as well as managing stress and anxiety. And I think many of us who are living through these COVID days recognize the importance in terms of stress and anxiety as well. So that's sort of where we are on the evidence base. Here's a list of the references. I'm not going to go through those, but you can always access them at a later point. A few lessons learned on obesity prevention. First, we need to document the evidence of impact. We have a fair amount of evidence on specific interventions, but we don't necessarily have as much evidence as we'd like to have at scale. And ultimately, that's what matters. So the evidence coming out of countries like Chile and Mexico, absolutely critical. We do also know that we want to continue to implement diet-related taxes along with nutrient profiling and labeling. But again, we need to be careful how these taxes are designed. And we need to consider a regional approach to this as well, because cross-border taxation or cross-border movement of foods can become a real challenge if you haven't considered that. So that's a big lesson learned from some of these issues. And we also need to coordinate and sequence diet-related taxes with other tax reforms as well, as part of a larger tax reform package. And that is really critical as well. You can't have it just as a small piece on the side. So in terms of research, there are 5 key areas that have been that we have identified. First, around documenting impact, like I said earlier, both around these fiscal policies, regulatory policies, as well as transport and urban design, which are becoming really important. And one area that we don't have enough evidence on, and we should have, given what the world is dealing with today, is around quantifying the climate co-benefits of investing in overweight and obesity prevention. We know, I mean, I didn't talk about it very much, but there is evidence around climate effects of meat production and its impact on overweight and obesity as well. So we need to document that. On the food system side, we certainly need to build the evidence base, there's no doubt. We also really need to build the evidence base around engaging the private sector in a responsible way. I don't know how many of you have seen the recent report from Nestle that 60% of their foods are in fact unhealthy foods and cannot be reformulated. That's really worrisome. And I'm sure there are similar issues with other private sector groups as well. So we need to work with that. And then we need to quantify the contribution of overweight and obesity to the human capital index, which is something that many countries are focusing on right now. We know there are links between them, but we have not as yet quantified exactly what those links might look like. So some of this research is already ongoing. There is a group called the Cost of Obesity Advisory Group that is doing a fair amount of research, and we, as a member of that group, we anticipate a publication coming quite soon, focusing on the economic impacts of obesity. And I won't go through the details of this slide, but just to say that is work that is ongoing, but there's space for a lot more people to be doing a lot more work on this issue. And as I was saying earlier, there are many, many challenges that remain. On the financing for undernutrition side, like I said, we've estimated what the costs are. We've also estimated more recently that we need an additional, over and above the 7 billion per year, we need an additional 1.2 billion a year to mitigate the COVID-related impacts. And all of these have to be over and above the investments for nutrition-sensitive actions in agriculture, social protection, the conditional cash transfers and stuff, and water and sanitation. So that's on the undernutrition side, and we are not there at all as yet in terms of getting the financing that is needed. And then on the right-hand side, I've mentioned the role of the private sector. So these are just a few challenges. And I don't know how many of you have seen the study that Helen Keller International did in Nepal, where they showed that actually even for children 12 to 23 months of age, unhealthy snack foods and beverages are 25% of their energy intake. Think about a country like Nepal that has such good local foods available, but it's these unhealthy foods that seem to be taking over their food systems. And anything from biscuits and candies to chips and cakes and donuts, as well as instant noodles, which I don't have in this slide, but those are a big part of the Nepalese cuisine now. And that's really worrisome to see something like that. And a recent study in the UK that showed 68% of the foods consumed are either packaged or ultra-processed foods, all of which we know are bad for our health. And I mentioned the issue around Nestle already and their foods. So there are still many, many challenges. And as we think about addressing these challenges, we need to think about repurposing existing public support. Currently, roughly $570 billion of public support are provided to agricultural producers across the world. I mean, just think about that number. We're asking for 7 billion plus 1.2, 8.2 billion for undernutrition. And here there are $570 billion. Much of this is regressive investments or regressive subsidies. So these can be repurposed. At the same time, we need to crowd in private sector investment. In COVID times, we know that overseas development aid is hugely impacted. We know that domestic financing in countries is hugely impacted. So those are not going to be able to address the growing demands. Instead, we need to think about crowding in private sector investments through innovative financing approaches. And one of those is the Power of Nutrition that co-finances with the World Bank and with some of the other partners like UNICEF as well. They co-finance with us, focusing primarily on the undernutrition side. I think there are chances to think about innovative financing sources for the overweight obesity side as well. And then we really need to advocate with the private sector in terms of improving the quality of food. And at the same time, from a global public good point of view, need to step up consumer education and leverage partnerships. And this is an example from Peru, focusing on the undernutrition side, but I just wanted to share a recipe for success. Peru has done incredibly well in reducing child stunting. And really, there's a recipe was getting high-level political commitment. We had the leaders from Peru on video conferences with bank teams talking about how to address it, put it on the media, focused on issues like results-based financing, mechanisms like results-based financing, where incentive systems were set up for improving results, not just for doing something, but when we received results. And then integrating nutrition into social protection schemes. And these are the sorts of strategies that we might want to think about on the overweight obesity side as well, though we're not there as yet on that. So moving on, I'm almost going to finish in a few minutes. We know that 2021, it's a make or break year for nutrition. There are 2 big summits that are planned. I'm sure everyone in the room has heard about the UN Food Systems Summit that's coming up in September. And then the Nutrition for Growth Summit in December 2021 that will be hosted by the government of Japan. While the UN Food Systems Summit, there are many partners you can see on this slide across 5 action tracks that will be working on that. From the World Bank's point of view, as is to be expected, we focus on the finance side. So our teams are working with the Food Systems Summit on the finance side. And then on the Tokyo Nutrition for Growth, again, there are 5 priority areas from health, including using this momentum on universal health coverage and ensuring that nutrition becomes a part of that. Building on the Food Systems Summit, on the food side, addressing resilience, but also really focusing on accountability and data, which is absolutely critical. And of course, we know that securing new investments, you've heard me say that already a few times, without financing, no country will be able to achieve what they need to achieve. And really also focusing on effective financing and getting results. Ultimately, that is really important. A lot of times we see resources that are invested in interventions that will not necessarily have an impact. So going forward, and for G, Nutrition for Growth, we've really focused on getting more money for nutrition. That is our mantra, but also part of the mantra is more nutrition for the money that is being spent. And of course, accountability so that we can get to the SDG goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the World Health Assembly goals. And in order to realize these goals, like I said, more nutrition for the money, which is through the World Bank. We have 2 windows, IDA and IBRD. We do want to still focus on domestic financing, recognizing that this may be challenged in COVID times, but also a huge focus on catalytic financing, innovative financing. The Power of Nutrition is one of them. The Global Financing Facility is another. I think we all need to put our heads together and come up with new mechanisms, particularly getting resources out of the private sector. And of course, we talked a little bit about diet-related taxes. And countries like Mexico told us they have put together some SDG bonds that they are selling to raise resources for the SDGs in general. And then thinking about more nutrition for the money that is spent, really focusing some of the things that we in epidemiology or public health don't always think about, but public financial management is absolutely critical in order to make sure resources are used the way they should be. And that means evidence-based planning in the first place, making sure we do financial analysis, including public expenditure reviews, expenditure tracking, so on and so forth, and a lot of focus on evaluation so that we can document what has been achieved. And I can't emphasize enough about the need for data. I'm going to end with one example of a tool that we have developed that helps to improve what we refer to as allocating efficiency for different funding levels. How can, with the same amount of resources, get more bang for your buck? That really is the question. And we've done a bunch of trainings across the world. We are continuing to do the trainings around the tool as well. And this is just one example from Pakistan, which shows that with the current level of spending that Pakistan has, there are roughly 2.1 million alive and non-stunted children that that we can achieve with those resources. If we were to allocate it in one way, which is the current, if we were to allocate additional resources in Pakistan that they were considering in a certain way, and over here, I hope you can see the arrows that I'm pointing to as well. On the right-hand side are the various interventions that we have tried to optimize. And with what was being considered, they would be able to save, with the additional resources, about 62,000 additional children. But if we optimize those, so trying to get the maximum bang for the buck and reallocate the resources across these interventions, you can actually, instead of saving 62,000, you can save 296,000 children with the same amount of resources. So this is just one example of an optimization tool that really helps countries, and we train countries to use these tools as they develop their national action plans. So let me stop there. I hope that that was useful, and I really want to make sure that we have time for discussion. Over to you, Wendy. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Meera, for this very great presentation. And I think there were several eye-opening and surprising figures and numbers, at least for me, and also some very necessary, but also very challenging steps to take for the future. So I think a lot of food for thought. I saw that we have a few questions already, and I'll start with the first one from Antonio Palmera. Do you know about any efforts to tax physical activity similar to what was done for the sugar taxes?
That's a very interesting question, and I must say I do not know anything at scale in terms of taxing physical inactivity, and I'm not even sure how we would be able to measure or monitor it at a public health scale. But having said that, I'm just putting my thinking hat on, given that you asked me a creative question. We've seen private sector companies offer gyms and physical exercise options to their workers. And I think, so it's more incentivizing rather than taxing that I have seen. And I'm just reminded that many years ago, the police force in the Philippines was asked to reduce their weight or else. And it was a very interesting approach. I must say I've not followed it through, but it was an interesting approach, and maybe worth, somebody in the audience may know more about that, but I have not heard of taxing physical inactivity. It's an interesting concept. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Meera. A second question was from Estelle Lambert, and it was when you were talking about the different strategies that we could take. So Estelle highlighted that it was a wonderful overview, but the difficulty in documenting evidence of impact is the aspect of attribution, as there are secular trends and complex packages of strategies, and it's difficult to know which or what can be attributed where the bang for the buck is found. So she wanted you to elaborate on that a bit further.
Great, that's a great question as well. Indeed, in any evaluations across the world, attribution, especially in real life programmatic evaluation, it's one thing when we do lab-based or controlled experiments, then attribution becomes much easier. But in any large-scale evaluations, whether it's in public health or something else, attribution becomes a real challenge. But having said that, over time, I think, and sometimes my economist friends get upset with me about saying that, but there are tools in public health and epidemiology and biostatistics that really do help you get as close to attribution as possible. And you will see, I think the Chile results have already been published. I'm not 100% sure, but they were in the process of being published. If you look at Barry Popkin, if you Google Barry Popkin, you'll see that he may have published already. Similarly, Mexico has done some evaluations. They come close to attribution. And in public health, we hold ourselves to much higher levels of scrutiny than economists do. And that's what upsets my economist friends in the bank sometimes. I think if we can document potential attribution, and we can also do some, many countries are also starting to do some qualitative evaluations around the area. And if you can put all this evidence together, then you can come closer to attribution. But can you do a randomized control trial and be absolutely sure? Not at a public health level. So it's a good challenge to have, but there are tools available in biostatistics and, like I said, qualitative analyses that can bring these things together and give you a fair level of confidence in terms of attribution.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Anna Mitchell. Using what we have learned from Mexico and Chile, where should other countries start that have not yet taken steps with labeling, taxation, etc.?
Yeah, so lots and lots of really good lessons from Mexico and Chile, and that publication that I mentioned to you on obesity and health and economic consequences of obesity, we've tried to summarize some of the lessons that have been learned. I won't go through the details of all of the lessons, but on taxation in particular, like I was saying in the presentation, it's really important to design the taxes in a way that works in the country, within the country context. So should you tax based on the size of the bottle of sodas or sugar-sweetened beverages? Should you tax on the basis of the amount of sugar in them? Should you tax in some other way? That's a very context-specific decision that needs to be made. And Chile has shown us some of those that work for Chile. It doesn't mean that every lesson will, that will work for every other country, but it gives us some ideas about the sorts of things to think about. And like I said, the details are there in that publication, which is available on the bank's website. Yeah. And we are actually working with some of our colleagues who work specifically on taxation design to make sure that these things are designed in the right way. Some countries, if I remember correctly, the Kerala state in India tried to do what was called fat taxes. And they experimented with it, and then it got overtaken by what is referred to as GST, other taxes. And it didn't quite work out, and there's a lesson there. There are lessons to be learned from what worked and a lesson to be learned from what did not work also. So, like I said, context specific is really important. There's no recipe per se.
Okay, I received an additional question on that. Has any country explored a processing tax for food?
Not that I'm aware of. There is no processing tax on foods, but there are some discussions ongoing about ultra-processed foods. So just to clarify, none of us are or probably should be against processing per se. Processing can be, as everybody knows, can be useful, especially in poor environments. where food is grown in plentiful in one season and then in another season it is scarce. You want to be able to process it and to be able to use it when it's less available. But the important, and similarly on the processing side, I'm sure everyone in this room has heard about food fortification. So adding micronutrients, vitamins and minerals to food to make it more healthy is good processing. So there can be good processing and there can be not so good processing. So that's one. The important thing is to focus on what sort of processing is done and whether it confers health benefits or whether it actually takes away from the benefits and adds ultra-processed foods, trans fats, those sorts of things that we know are bad for our health. So to answer your question, I do not know of a country that has considered taxation on processing per se. But there were countries, I remember some years ago, I think it's not active anymore, Poland had tried to tax meat or high-fat products. So every country has tried something different, some more successful than others. And like I said, some of the details are in the publication that I referred to.
Thank you, Meera. Another question, a question regarding taxation, or even going further, from Annie Anderson. Although taxation of sugar, sweetened beverages and other discretionary foods is a great starting point, there seems to be little work on decreasing availability. Are there good examples, apart from school settings, where availability has been limited, banned from certain settings?
So I'm not sure whether you refer to availability in the market, availability in the home, or availability where, but I think in school settings, as the question refers to, certainly reducing access to what we refer to as SSBs, sugar-sweetened beverages. And by the way, that needs to include not just sodas, but a lot of what are considered healthy fruit juices. There are actually a lot of them, as you all know probably well. A lot of them are full of sugar. So those need to be included in the sugar-sweetened beverages. In schools, we've seen a reduction in consumption. I'm not sure I know enough about availability. It's something that probably we should look at from a private sector point of view. But availability will only go down if we can convince the private sector. And that's why I think in this space, the private sector is such an important player, working with them to reduce and to change the food products that they market to the world. And interestingly, what we are also seeing from an availability, or I don't know what, availability, access, production point of view, is that more and more of these unhealthy foods are being made available in low and middle income countries. I gave you the example of Nepal. I mean, imagine, I usually ask this as a question to the audience when we have a live audience. Which country do you think has the highest per capita consumption of instant noodles? And it's Nepal. You would never think so. But why did that happen? The private sector has flooded the market with these instant noodles. People look at it. There is some aspiration, especially among rural communities, to become more "quote unquote" modern, and they see these foods are convenient. They see these as a way of moving up the social structure. Unfortunately, that's where it all goes. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but it's all about production, availability, access, and these are often priced to sell in low middle income countries. So put all these things together and it really does make a difference. Yeah.
Maybe an extra question from me here, because you say we have to convince the private sector to do better, but how can we convince them? How can we engage them to sponsor more in better ways, create changes? Because it was something that you highlighted a few times. We need more money for nutrition and we need the private sector to engage in this. But how do we get them that far? And yeah.
Yeah, that is a real challenge. And I think there are many ways to engage the private sector. One way, which I referred to, is through innovative financing, such as the Power of Nutrition. And essentially what they do is they crowd in resources from the private sector and they match it with public sector resources, and then they bring it to the World Bank and we take it to the countries. So every dollar that a private sector group invests through the Power of Nutrition gets multiplied at least 4 times, sometimes 6 to 8 times by the time it reaches the country. So that's the innovative part of that financing. Those of you who are interested can Google the Power of Nutrition and look at their business model. I think it's an interesting way. So that's one way. The other way to engage is, as you know, many of the private sector companies have something called CSR, and they do little projects through their CSR approaches. And we really think, if I had another 24 hours in a day, that's what I would work on, to get these private sector companies to actually pull their CSR resources into something that can be more meaningful and applied carefully. Sometimes these CSR approaches are good, but they're very minuscule. But sometimes they can lead to real unintended consequences. Let me mention, there was one time a private sector company decided to hand out uniforms to school uniforms to children whose parents had been affected by HIV/AIDS. Well, these kids got the uniforms, they went to school. Next day, everybody in the school knew whose children, which parents were HIV positive. So good intentions, but it doesn't always work out. So pooling these resources in a meaningful way and addressing the challenge at the global level, that's a big challenge. If anybody in the room wants to do it, I will help you support that with my other hat on. Then, of course, reformulation of foods is absolutely critical as well. How do we work with them to reformulate foods to make them healthier? And like I said, there are groups like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that are working to fortify foods. There are other ways of improving the quality of this food. That's a harder thing to do, but I think private sector companies are starting to think about doing that. We had a session with the Wall Street Journal one time with private sector companies, and they all at least showed the intention. If we can show them that there is a bottom line potential for them as well, then I think we should be able to do that. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're at the end of this session. I think the last minute is starting. So I just want to thank you and also highlight that several people indicated that they really enjoyed your presentation and thought it was excellent. So thanks again for the great presentation and the answers on most of the questions. I don't think we answered all the questions, but most of the questions. Thank you to the audience for being here and being involved too by asking questions. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the audience, and thank you to you, Wendy, and thank you to ISB and PA for the invitation. I really enjoyed it as well.
Great.